The most dangerous man in a prison camp is not the one who shouts the loudest, it's the one who stays silent. The jungle air hung thick and heavy over Katsura prisoner of war camp, a forgotten patch of dirt carved into the hills of the Philippine Islands in the summer of 1944. By 8 in the morning the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees, and the sun pressed down on the camp like a weight no one could escape. Rows of American prisoners stood in the hard-packed yard, their uniforms faded and their shoulders slumped from months of exhaustion. No one spoke. Not because they didn't want to, but because silence had become a form of survival here. Every sound carried across the yard, and every sound could draw the wrong kind of attention. At the center of the compound stood Colonel Hiroshi Takeda, the commanding officer of the camp, a man whose presence alone could drain the air from a room. He walked slowly along the line of prisoners with his hands folded behind his back, his polished boots pressing careful prints into the dust. Takeda was not a large man, but he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who believed the entire world existed in ranks and hierarchies. To him, this place was not merely a prison camp. It was a stage. And every prisoner standing in that line was part of a lesson he intended to teach. The guards watched from the towers above, rifles resting against their shoulders, but even they rarely spoke when Takeda entered the yard. They knew his rituals. The inspections. The silent tests of discipline. The moments where he would pause in front of a prisoner and simply stare, waiting to see who would break first. A young American soldier named Private James Walker stood near the middle of the line, his eyes fixed on the ground, trying not to draw attention. Walker had arrived at the camp only 3 weeks earlier, captured during a failed supply run along the coast. He had learned quickly that the safest position in Katsura camp was the one where no one noticed you. But Takeda noticed everything. The colonel stopped in front of Walker, tilting his head slightly as if studying an object rather than a man. The yard grew even quieter. Somewhere beyond the fence line a distant bird called. Out from the jungle, the sound echoing over the camp before fading into the heavy morning heat. Takeda said nothing. He simply stood there for several long seconds, letting the silence stretch thin enough that every prisoner could feel it. Then, without another word, he continued walking down the line. The tension eased just enough for a few men to breathe again. But the moment of relief did not last. Because at the very end of the row stood someone new. A man the guards had transferred into the camp the night before. He looked older than most of the prisoners, maybe in his mid-40s, with sun-worn skin and a calm expression that didn't quite fit the desperation that filled the rest of the yard. His name was Daniel Carter. He stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, his eyes forward, as if the oppressive heat and the weight of the camp meant nothing at all. When Colonel Takeda finally reached the end of the line, he stopped again. This time the silence felt different. He looked directly at Carter, studying the new prisoner with the same slow patience he used on everyone else. Around them, dozens of men watched without moving, because something about the moment felt unusual even in a place like this. No one in that yard knew it yet. Not the prisoners. Not the guards in the towers. Not even Colonel Takeda himself. But the quiet man standing at the end of the line had once trained hundreds of United States Marines in hand-to-hand combat. And before this summer was over, the balance of power inside Katsura camp was going to change. By midday the heat over Katsura camp had turned the air thick enough to feel like a blanket pressing against the skin. The prisoners had been dismissed from the inspection line hours earlier, but the tension from that moment still lingered across the yard like the echo of distant thunder. Men moved slowly between their assigned tasks, carrying water buckets, repairing sections of the fence, sweeping the dust from walkways that would be covered again within minutes. Nothing in the camp truly changed. The routines repeated every day with mechanical precision. Wake at sunrise. Stand for inspection. Work until the sun began to sink behind the jungle hills. Then return to the wooden barracks where the long nights stretched even longer than the days. Private James Walker sat on the edge of a wooden crate near the supply shed, wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his faded uniform. From where he sat he could see the newest prisoner moving quietly along the perimeter of the yard. Daniel Carter carried a small stack of wooden planks toward the maintenance building, his pace steady and unhurried despite the heat. Walker watched him for a moment before leaning closer to the man beside him. "The newcomer does not look like the others," Walker whispered. The older prisoner sitting next to him, a former Navy radio operator named Samuel Ortiz, followed Walker's gaze. Ortiz had been in the camp for almost a year, long enough to recognize the subtle differences between the men who arrived broken and the men who arrived waiting. "That one is different," Ortiz said quietly. "Look at the way he walks." Walker studied Carter more carefully now. The man did not shuffle like the others. His shoulders remained straight, his breathing even, as if the oppressive air and endless work were nothing more than background noise. When a guard shouted an order across the yard, Carter simply nodded once and adjusted his direction without any sign of frustration or fear. It was the kind of calm that did not belong inside a place like Katsura Camp. Across the compound Colonel Takeda stood beneath the narrow shade of the command building porch, watching the yard with the same patient attention he gave to everything inside his camp. He had noticed the new prisoner the moment the man stepped into the inspection line that morning. Most arrivals carried their defeat openly. It showed in the lowered heads, the uncertain posture, the restless glances toward the guards. But Daniel Carter had shown none of those things. The colonel rested his hands behind his back as he studied the man moving through the yard. There was discipline in that posture. Not the forced obedience of a prisoner, but the practiced control of someone who had spent years mastering himself. Takeda did not yet know the name of the new arrival, but he had learned long ago that unusual behavior in a prison camp was never an accident. In places like this every man revealed who he truly was under pressure. And pressure was something Katsura Camp provided in abundance. Near the water pump Walker watched Carter finish stacking the wooden planks beside the maintenance shed. The older man paused for a moment, scanning the yard with quiet awareness before lifting a bucket of water and carrying it toward the barracks. Walker noticed something strange then. Carter moved with the natural balance of someone who had spent a lifetime training his body. Every step looked deliberate, efficient, almost effortless. Ortiz noticed it too. "That is not a construction worker," the radio operator murmured. Walker frowned. "What do you mean?" Ortiz kept his voice low. "I spent 20 years listening to officers walk across steel decks. You learn to recognize discipline by the sound of footsteps alone. That man has it." Walker looked back toward Carter as the man disappeared through the barracks doorway. For the first time since arriving at the camp Walker felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Curiosity. And somewhere across the compound Colonel Takeda was beginning to feel it too. The sun had already begun its slow descent toward the jungle hills when the prisoners were finally ordered back to the barracks. Evening in Katsura Camp did not bring relief from the heat, but it brought something the men valued even more than cooler air. A brief moment where the guards became less watchful and the endless rhythm of commands faded into the background. Inside Barracks 3 the wooden walls trapped the warmth of the day, turning the long room into a quiet oven filled with tired men lying on narrow bunks. Private James Walker sat near the entrance, stretching his aching legs across the rough floorboards while Samuel Ortiz leaned against the wall beside him. Around them dozens of prisoners spoke in low voices about the same things they always spoke about. Home. The war. And the endless question of when any of this might end. But Walker found himself looking toward the far end of the barracks where Daniel Carter sat alone on the edge of his bunk. The older man had barely spoken all afternoon. He had finished his assigned work, carried water with the others, and returned to the barracks without drawing attention to himself. Yet something about his presence continued to pull Walker's focus back again and again. Carter sat with his hands resting calmly on his knees, his back straight despite the rough wooden frame behind him. His breathing remained slow and steady, almost as if he were resting in a quiet park rather than inside a crowded prisoner barracks surrounded by exhausted soldiers. Walker finally leaned closer to Ortiz. "I still say that man is not ordinary," he whispered. Ortiz gave a small nod without looking away from Carter. "You are not the only one who noticed," he replied. "Half the men in this room are wondering the same thing." As if sensing the attention, Carter slowly lifted his eyes and looked across the barracks. His gaze moved calmly from face to face, not searching for anything in particular but taking in the room with quiet awareness. When his eyes met Walker's, the younger soldier felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over him. Carter gave a slight nod, the kind of small acknowledgement one soldier might give another, then returned his attention to the floor. Walker frowned slightly. "Did you see that?" he asked. Ortiz smiled faintly. "I did. That is the look of someone who understands exactly where he is." Outside the barracks the sound of boots crossed the gravel walkway. A guard shouted an order somewhere near the mess shed, and the low conversations inside the room faded to silence until the footsteps passed. These small pauses had become part of the prisoners' routine. The entire camp existed in cycles of tension and stillness. Yet Daniel Carter seemed untouched by either one. After several minutes Carter stood and walked slowly toward the water barrel near the door. The movement drew little attention from the guards outside, but inside the barracks several men quietly shifted their focus toward him. Carter dipped a tin cup into the barrel and took a slow drink before setting the cup back beside the container. Then he did something unexpected. He looked toward the group of younger soldiers sitting along the wall, including Walker, and spoke for the first time since arriving in the camp. His voice was calm, steady, and surprisingly clear in the quiet room. "The hardest part of being here is not the heat or the work," he said. "It is forgetting who you were before you arrived." The men listened carefully. Carter continued in the same even tone. "Discipline is not something a prison can take away unless you give it up yourself. Remember how you stand. Remember how you breathe. And remember that every difficult place eventually reaches its end." No one spoke for several seconds after he finished. The words were simple, yet they carried a quiet strength that spread through the room like a steady current. Walker exchanged a glance with Ortiz. The older radio operator gave a slow nod. "I told you earlier," Ortiz whispered. "That man has the walk of a soldier." Walker looked back toward Carter, who had already returned to his bunk and sat once again with that same quiet posture. Somewhere beyond the barracks walls Colonel Takeda stood on the porch of the command building watching the fading light across the yard. The colonel had spent the entire afternoon reviewing reports from his guards. One detail appeared again and again in their notes. The new prisoner in Barracks 3 had spoken very little, yet the other men were beginning to watch him. Takeda closed the report folder slowly. Experience had taught him that influence inside a prison rarely appeared loudly. It arrived quietly, like a ripple moving across still water. And the colonel had begun to suspect that the calm man named Daniel Carter might become the most interesting ripple Katsura camp had seen in a very long time. Morning arrived slowly over Katsura camp, the pale sunlight creeping through the thin jungle mist that clung to the hills beyond the fences. The air was quieter at dawn than any other time of day, as if even the war itself paused for a brief moment before the routines of the camp began again. Inside Barracks 3 the prisoners stirred awake one by one as the distant clang of a metal bell echoed across the compound. Men rose from narrow wooden bunks, stretching stiff muscles and rubbing sleep from tired eyes while the familiar sounds of boots and shouted orders began to return outside. Private James Walker stepped out into the yard with the others, the early morning air still carrying a hint of coolness before the tropical heat would take over again. The prisoners formed their usual lines in the open dirt square while guards watched from the perimeter towers. Across the yard the command building stood elevated on its wooden platform, the front porch already occupied by Colonel Hiroshi Takeda. The colonel observed the formation silently, his posture rigid, his gaze scanning the rows of prisoners with the patient attention of a man who believed that control came from noticing the smallest changes. And this morning there was something different. It was not obvious at first. The lines of prisoners still stood quietly. Their uniforms were still worn and faded. Their faces still carried the exhaustion of long days under the relentless sun. Yet Takeda sensed a shift in the atmosphere of the yard. The men stood just a little straighter than they had the day before. Their eyes did not drop quite as quickly when the guards passed by. The difference was subtle, but to a man like Takeda subtle changes were often the most important ones. His gaze moved along the line until it stopped near the center of the formation where Daniel Carter stood among the others. The new prisoner looked no different from the rest at first glance. His uniform hung loosely from weeks of rationed meals. Dust clung to the sleeves and shoulders of his shirt. Yet his posture remained balanced and calm as he waited with the others for the morning inspection to begin. Carter's breathing was slow and steady, his shoulders relaxed even under the watchful eyes of the guards. Around him several younger prisoners stood with a similar posture, as if unconsciously mirroring the quiet discipline of the older man beside them. Walker noticed it too as he stood only a few feet away. The way Carter held himself seemed to change the energy of the men around him. No one spoke about it openly, but the effect was impossible to ignore. When the command was given for the inspection line to step forward, the prisoners moved in unison across the yard. Boots pressed into the dust as the formation passed beneath the watchtower shadows and stopped once again in the center of the square. Colonel Takeda descended the wooden steps from the command building and walked slowly toward the line. Each step carried the calm authority of a man who believed that every inch of ground inside the camp belonged to him. The guards fell silent as he approached. Takeda began his usual inspection, moving from one prisoner to the next with the same deliberate pace he used every morning. He studied their posture, their uniforms, their expressions. Some men looked away quickly. Others stared straight ahead, determined not to show weakness. Yet when Takeda reached the center of the line again, he paused. Daniel Carter stood before him with the same composed expression he had shown the previous day. For several seconds the two men regarded each other without speaking. The silence spread outward through the line as prisoners and guards alike sensed the quiet tension forming between them. Takeda finally spoke in a calm voice that carried easily across the yard. "You are adapting to the camp quickly," he said. Carter met the colonel's gaze without defiance and without fear. "Discipline travels with a man wherever he goes," Carter replied quietly. Takeda studied him for another moment before continuing down the line. Yet as he walked away, the colonel's expression had changed slightly. For the first time since Daniel Carter arrived at Katsura camp, Colonel Hiroshi Takeda had begun to wonder who this quiet prisoner truly was. The sun climbed higher over Katsura camp until the yard shimmered with waves of heat rising from the packed dirt ground. By late morning the prisoners had already been working for several hours, moving supplies, repairing sections of the outer fence, and clearing debris from the narrow paths that wound between the barracks. The guards watched carefully from the shaded walkways, their eyes scanning the yard for any sign of hesitation or disobedience. Yet something subtle had begun to change among the prisoners, something quiet enough that most of the guards could not immediately explain it. Men who once kept their eyes fixed on the ground now occasionally looked forward when they walked. Their shoulders were still tired, but their posture carried a hint of steadiness that had not been there before. Colonel Hiroshi Takeda noticed these details from the porch of the command building. He stood motionless, hands folded behind his back, watching the movement of the prisoners as carefully as a chess player studying a board. Takeda believed that control inside a camp like Katsura came not from loud displays of authority but from understanding the currents that flowed beneath the surface. And over the past 24 hours he had sensed a small but unmistakable shift moving through the yard. His eyes settled once again on Daniel Carter. The American prisoner was carrying a wooden crate across the compound toward the maintenance shed, walking beside two younger soldiers who struggled slightly under the weight of their own load. Carter did not speak much as he moved, but when one of the younger men slowed his pace Carter adjusted his step so the group could continue together without drawing attention. The movement was simple, almost invisible, yet Takeda saw the effect it had. The younger soldiers straightened their shoulders and continued forward with renewed focus. Takeda narrowed his eyes slightly. Influence inside a prison rarely arrived through commands. It arrived through example. And the quiet American seemed to understand that principle very well. Across the yard, Private James Walker was beginning to understand it too. The past 2 days had felt different in ways he could not easily explain. The work was still exhausting. The heat still pressed against his skin like a constant weight. Yet Carter's presence had introduced something new into the barracks and the yard alike. The older Marine spoke only occasionally, but when he did the words were simple and direct. Stand straight. Breathe slowly. Remember who you are. Walker had repeated those words to himself several times that morning as he carried supplies across the camp. Each time he did, the endless routine felt just a little easier to endure. Near the water pump, Samuel Ortiz watched the same quiet transformation spreading among the men. He leaned slightly toward Walker as they paused beside the barrel. You see it now, Ortiz said softly. Walker nodded. I do. It is like the whole place is standing a little taller. Ortiz gave a thoughtful glance toward Carter. Leadership does not always come from rank. Sometimes it comes from the man who refuses to let the world decide who he is. Walker followed Ortiz's gaze and saw Carter setting down the crate near the maintenance shed. The Marine wiped his hands on his uniform sleeve and briefly looked across the yard, his eyes moving with calm awareness over the prisoners and guards alike. There was no defiance in that look, but there was something equally powerful. Confidence. On the porch of the command building, Colonel Takeda turned slowly and walked back into his office. A thin folder waited on the desk beside the window. Inside were the records of new arrivals processed through the camp over the past week. Takeda opened the folder and scanned the pages until he found the name he was looking for. Daniel Carter. Age 46. Former United States Marine Corps instructor. Takeda read the line twice before closing the folder again. The colonel stepped back to the window and looked across the yard where Carter was once again moving quietly among the prisoners. A faint expression crossed Takeda's face, not anger, but curiosity mixed with something sharper. For the first time since the Marine arrived, the commander of Katsura Camp understood that the calm man in Barracks 3 might be far more than just another prisoner. The afternoon sun burned low and heavy over Katsura Camp, turning the air thick with heat and dust that clung to every surface. The prisoners had been ordered back into the central yard after the midday work shift, standing in loose rows while guards moved along the edges of the compound. It was not the usual inspection hour, and that alone made the atmosphere feel different. Men exchanged quiet glances without speaking, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Private James Walker stood beside Samuel Ortiz near the middle of the group, the wooden ground beneath his boots still warm from the relentless sun. Walker noticed Daniel Carter standing a few yards away, calm as always, his posture straight but relaxed as he waited without asking questions. Carter had learned long ago that when authority called a gathering without explanation, the wisest response was patience. On the porch of the command building, Colonel Hiroshi Takeda stepped forward slowly, his uniform crisp despite the humid air. The guards fell silent as he descended the wooden steps and walked toward the center of the yard. His expression remained controlled, but his eyes moved with careful attention across the rows of prisoners. Takeda stopped when he reached the open space in front of the formation and turned to face them. For a few seconds he said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch across the yard until every man could feel it settle into place. Then he spoke in a calm voice that carried easily through the still air. Discipline is the foundation of every army, he said. Without it, men become scattered and weak. With it, even the smallest group can stand firm against impossible circumstances. Several guards shifted slightly behind him, watching the prisoners closely. Takeda continued speaking as if addressing a class of students rather than a yard filled with captured soldiers. I have observed something interesting during the past 2 days, he said. The posture of this camp has changed. The men stand differently. They move differently. Takeda paused for a moment, letting his gaze sweep across the prisoners again before finally resting on Daniel Carter. The shift began after a certain individual arrived. The yard remained silent, but nearly every prisoner knew exactly who the colonel was referring to. Carter did not react. He simply stood with the same steady composure he had shown since the day he entered the camp. Takeda stepped a little closer. "Daniel Carter," he said clearly. "Step forward." Walker felt his chest tighten as Carter calmly walked out from the line and stopped a few feet in front of the colonel. The two men faced each other beneath the bright afternoon sun, the rest of the yard watching with quiet attention. Takeda studied Carter carefully, as if measuring the man against an invisible standard only he understood. "Your record says you trained Marines," Takeda said. Carter nodded once. "I helped prepare them for difficult situations," he replied. Takeda tilted his head slightly. "And now you find yourself in one of those situations." Carter's expression remained unchanged. "Discipline does not disappear when circumstances change," he said. Takeda considered that answer for several seconds. Around them the guards watched closely while the prisoners stood motionless, unsure where the conversation might lead. Finally the colonel turned slightly toward the rest of the yard. "A camp such as this must remain orderly," Takeda said. "An order requires clarity about who leads and who follows." He looked back at Carter. "Tomorrow morning, we will test the strength of your discipline in front of the entire camp." The word settled over the yard like a sudden change in weather. Carter did not argue. He simply gave a small respectful nod. As he stepped back toward the line, Walker felt Ortiz lean closer and whisper quietly beside him. "The commander thinks he is setting a lesson," Ortiz said. Walker kept his eyes forward. "And Carter?" he asked softly. Ortiz watched the calm Marine return to his place among the prisoners. "Carter knows that lessons can go both ways." The next morning arrived with a strange stillness hanging over Katsura camp. Even before the metal bell rang across the compound, many of the prisoners were already awake, sitting quietly on their bunks as the pale gray light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the wooden barracks walls. Word had traveled through the camp faster than any guard could stop it. Everyone knew that Colonel Hiroshi Takeda had arranged a public test for Daniel Carter. No one knew exactly what the test would be, but the entire camp understood its purpose. Takeda wanted to remind every prisoner who held authority inside these fences. Outside, the morning air carried the faint smell of damp earth and jungle leaves as the prisoners stepped into the yard and formed their usual lines. The temperature was still cool enough to breathe comfortably, but the tension in the yard made the atmosphere feel heavier than the heat that would come later. Private James Walker stood beside Samuel Ortiz once again, both men keeping their eyes forward while quietly observing the movement around them. Guards had gathered near the center of the yard, creating a wide circle in the packed dirt. Walker leaned slightly toward Ortiz. "This is not a normal inspection," he murmured. Ortiz shook his head slowly. "No," he said softly. "This is a demonstration." At the far side of the yard the door of the command building opened and Colonel Takeda stepped out onto the porch. His uniform was immaculate as always, the polished buttons reflecting the rising sunlight as he descended the steps with calm, measured strides. The guards immediately straightened as he approached the open space they had prepared. Takeda paused at the center of the yard and looked over the assembled prisoners. "Discipline reveals itself under observation," he said in a steady voice that carried across the compound. "Today we will observe it together." A guard called out Daniel Carter's name. The Marine stepped out of the line without hesitation and walked into the open space. Carter moved with the same quiet balance he had shown since arriving at the camp, his expression calm, his breathing steady as he stopped several feet from the colonel. The rest of the yard fell silent. Takeda turned toward one of his senior guards and gave a small nod. Another soldier stepped forward to stand opposite Carter. The man was taller and younger, a uniformed instructor who had spent years drilling discipline into the camp guards themselves. Takeda addressed the prisoners again. "Strength is not simply physical power," he said. "It is the ability to remain controlled when the world expects you to break." Walker felt the tension ripple through the men standing beside him. No one spoke, but every eye was fixed on the center of the yard. Carter remained composed, his posture relaxed yet focused as he looked calmly toward The guard standing across from him. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the two men moved. The action was brief and surprisingly quiet, more like a demonstration between trained professionals than the confrontation many prisoners had feared. Carter shifted his weight with practiced precision, guiding the momentum of the moment rather than resisting it. Within seconds the guard stepped back, clearly surprised, while Carter remained standing in the same calm posture he had begun with. A low murmur spread through the prisoners before quickly fading back into silence. Colonel Takeda watched the exchange without speaking. The colonel's expression did not change, but something thoughtful had appeared in his eyes. He turned slowly toward Carter. "Interesting," Takeda said quietly. The word carried across the still yard. Carter gave a respectful nod but said nothing. Takeda then looked out over the assembled prisoners, who now stood a little straighter than they had the day before. The demonstration had lasted only a few moments, yet the effect was unmistakable. Something had shifted inside Katsura camp, and everyone present could feel it. As Carter calmly stepped back into the line beside Walker and Ortiz, the younger soldier whispered under his breath. "I think the commander just realized something." Ortiz kept his gaze forward. "Yes," he replied softly. He realized that discipline does not belong to the man with the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who truly understands it. The yard remained unusually quiet long after the brief demonstration ended. The guards ordered the prisoners back to their work assignments, yet the energy moving through Katsura camp had shifted in a way that no command could reverse. Men walked across the compound carrying tools and supplies just as they had every other day, but there was a difference in their posture that even the guards began to notice. Shoulders were a little straighter. Movements were a little steadier. The silent example Daniel Carter had given in the center of the yard had spread through the camp faster than any spoken message. Private James Walker felt it as he lifted a wooden beam beside Samuel Ortiz near the maintenance shed. The weight of the beam had not changed, yet the work felt different somehow. He glanced across the yard where Carter was stacking equipment beside a row of supply crates. The Marine worked without drawing attention to himself, exactly as he had done since arriving at the camp. Yet several prisoners nearby had unconsciously begun matching his calm rhythm. Walker leaned closer to Ortiz as they carried the beam into position. "The whole place feels different," he said quietly. Ortiz gave a small nod. "Confidence spreads the same way fear does," he replied. "Only slower and stronger." Across the compound Colonel Hiroshi Takeda stood once again on the porch of the command building, observing the yard through narrowed eyes. The colonel had witnessed thousands of soldiers during his career. He understood discipline, structure, and the fragile balance that kept men under control in difficult environments. What he had seen that morning unsettled him in a way he had not expected. The Marine had not challenged authority. He had not spoken loudly or encouraged rebellion. Yet his calm presence had changed the behavior of an entire group of prisoners without a single command. Takeda turned and walked slowly into his office where the thin personnel file still rested on the desk. He opened it once more and studied the information inside. Daniel Carter, former instructor responsible for training Marine recruits in close combat discipline and physical control. The colonel closed the folder again and looked out through the office window toward the yard. Carter was speaking quietly to two younger prisoners now, showing them how to adjust their stance while lifting a crate so that the weight rested more evenly on their shoulders. The lesson appeared simple, almost mundane. Yet Takeda understood what it represented. The Marine was not teaching them how to resist the camp. He was teaching them how to endure it. That realization carried a different kind of power. Later that afternoon the prisoners were dismissed from their work detail and allowed to return briefly to the barracks before evening inspection. Inside Barracks 3 the atmosphere felt calmer than it had in weeks. Walker sat on his bunk while several men quietly repeated the breathing rhythm Carter had shown them earlier that day. Inhale slowly. Stand straight. Focus on the moment directly in front of you. Carter sat near the far wall watching the group with the same quiet patience he had shown since arriving. Walker finally looked toward him. "Why are you helping everyone like this?" he asked. Carter considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because discipline reminds a man who he is," he said calmly. "When people remember that, they stop feeling defeated." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. Samuel Ortiz gave a thoughtful nod from across the aisle. Outside the barracks the sun dipped low behind the jungle hills, casting long shadows across the yard where the guards prepared for evening inspection. On the porch of the command building Colonel Takeda watched the fading light stretch across the compound. He had intended that morning's demonstration to reinforce control inside the camp. Instead he had witnessed something far more complex. Authority built on fear could command obedience, but the calm discipline of one man had begun to inspire something stronger among the prisoners. As Takeda turned back toward the building, a single thought remained in his mind. If the Marines' influence continued to grow, the balance of power inside Katsura camp might slowly begin to change. Evening settled slowly over Katsura camp as the sun disappeared behind the thick jungle hills, leaving the compound bathed in long shadows and fading orange light. The final inspection of the day had ended, and the prisoners were allowed to return to their barracks as the guards rotated positions along the fences and watchtowers. The heat of the afternoon had finally begun to loosen its grip on the air, replaced by the softer sounds of insects rising from the surrounding forest. Inside Barracks 3 the men sat quietly on their bunks, the wooden room filled with the low hum of tired breathing and occasional whispers between soldiers who had survived another day. Private James Walker leaned back against the rough wall beside Samuel Ortiz, watching the last light filter through the narrow cracks in the boards. Across the room Daniel Carter sat on the edge of his bunk with the same calm posture he had carried since the day he arrived. The events of the morning had spread through the entire camp. Even men from the other barracks had heard about the brief demonstration in the yard and the surprising way the Marine had handled the situation. Yet Carter himself behaved as if nothing unusual had happened at all. He simply folded his hands together and breathed slowly, as if the entire world outside the barracks had grown quiet. Walker finally spoke in a low voice that carried just far enough for Carter to hear. "Most men would be celebrating after today," he said. Carter lifted his eyes toward him with a faint, thoughtful expression. "Celebration is for victories," he replied calmly. "Today was only a reminder." Walker frowned slightly. "A reminder of what?" Carter glanced around the room at the tired faces of the prisoners who were now watching him with quiet respect. "A reminder that strength does not always come from control over others," Carter said. "Sometimes it comes from control over yourself." The words settled into the room with a kind of steady warmth that no fire could provide. Several men nodded slowly, repeating the thought to themselves as if committing it to memory. Samuel Ortiz crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall, studying the Marine carefully. "You knew the commander would react the way he did," Ortiz said. Carter allowed a small smile to appear for the first time since entering the camp. "Men who build their authority on fear eventually become curious when they see someone who is not afraid," he said. Outside the barracks the sound of measured footsteps crossed the gravel path. Colonel Hiroshi Takeda walked slowly along the row of buildings, accompanied by 2 guards who kept a respectful distance behind him. The colonel paused briefly beside Barracks 3 and listened to the quiet voices inside before continuing his walk along the fence line. The night air carried the faint scent of jungle rain somewhere in the distance. Takeda stopped near the watchtower and looked back across the yard toward the barracks where the Marine was resting. For years the camp had operated under a simple balance. Authority above. Obedience below. Yet over the past few days that balance had begun to evolve into something more complicated. The prisoners had not become rebellious. They had not challenged the guards or refused their work. Instead they had become steadier, more focused, as if they had remembered a piece of themselves that captivity had nearly erased. Takeda folded his hands behind his back and stared into the quiet yard. He understood now that the Marine had not tried to defeat the camp. He had done something far more subtle. He had reminded the prisoners that discipline belonged to them as much as it belonged to their captors. Inside Barracks 3 the lamps dimmed as the guards ordered lights out for the night. The men lay down on their bunks while the distant sounds of the jungle filled the darkness beyond the walls. Walker closed his eyes but found himself thinking about the calm presence of the Marine across the room. Samuel Ortiz spoke quietly one last time before sleep arrived. "The commander wanted to prove that one man cannot change this place," he said softly. Walker glanced toward Carter in the darkness. "Do you think he was right?" he asked. Ortiz watched the steady silhouette of the Marine resting calmly on his bunk. "Sometimes one man cannot change a prison," Ortiz replied. "But he can remind everyone inside it who they really are. And in places like this, that reminder can be more powerful than any wall or command ever built."